Right. Our next topic is Struggling and Strong, Maintaining Resilience in a Stoic Service Culture. And this will be addressed by Dr. Duncan Shields. Duncan is a clinician who, over the past 23 years, has specialised in providing frontline mental health services to military, police and first responders. His current role as adjunct professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia in Canada builds on this foundation, focusing on research, evaluation and program development of culturally relevant initiatives to assist first responder and military personnel maintain or regain resiliency and well-being while coping with operational and traumatic stress. Before his academic studies, Dr. Shields served with the Governor-General's Foot Guards, a Canadian infantry regiment, where he developed a lifelong appreciation for the work and sacrifice of those who serve. Please welcome Dr. Duncan Shields.
Thank you. Is the microphone working? Can you hear me at the back? Yes. They let me off leash, so we're all in trouble now. I'm not leashed to the podium. I arrived in Brisbane a couple of days ago. It's lovely to be here. Already this morning I've picked up some key ideas that I'll be taking back to my work in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. And so it's really delightful to be, I'm delighted to be here. While I've been here, I've been picking up a few Australianisms, most of which I wouldn't dare repeat from up here. But a greeting that I hadn't actually heard before. How you going? How you going? And I've already been told that I sound like an idiot when I say that, so it's okay. But I was confused when she asked me this, and I said, by plane, which apparently wasn't the right response. She was confused, and then she called me darling, and I was even more confused. So it's interesting how cultural differences can create havoc in our ability to get messages across. So hopefully over the next 25 minutes or so, I'll do a better job of actually making myself clear and not simply confuse you. But what I will be talking about is a different kind of cultural gap, and one that when we fail to translate across it, has much more serious consequences. And that is simply the gap that exists between our culture and language of mental health and help seeking, and the culture and language of our military and first responder organizations, what I've collectively called here today stoic service cultures. I might actually need this. But when we fail to communicate what we know, and we've already heard this morning, we have an incredible amount of knowledge accumulated about post-traumatic stress. We do quite a good job even of creating the conditions for recovery. And yet, if we don't manage to communicate that in a culturally relevant way, then we not only miscommunicate, we miss opportunities. We miss the opportunity, and in the worst case scenario, we leave those who serve dealing with stigma, isolated, and under-resourced during some of the most difficult challenges that they face. And we also, and Sandy talked about this morning, in the history, when conflicts within the community of clinicians and researchers creates this kind of silencing of our voices so that we fail to attack stigma. We fail to weigh in to correct perceptions and mythologies about service and about stress. And when we fail to make our voices heard and communicate what we know to those who need that information, we inadvertently support an ongoing problematic binary narrative. A problematic binary narrative that is either or thinking, that you can either be strong or struggling, that you're either competent, fit, and have capacity to serve, or if you have any experiences, any impact of your service, then you're broken, you're weak, you're unfit. And that binary has very serious consequences for those who serve. So I'm going to take you into basically a journey on what we've been trying to do, because as a clinician first and foremost and a researcher second, I have always been interested in this question of translation. How do we take all of the information we know and make it relevant on the ground so that it's deployable in real time in the work of those who serve? How do we make this relevant? And so one of the things I'm going to talk about today is a very recent pilot study that we've been doing with the BC Professional Firefighters Association. It started in February of this year. It's brand spanking new. But it actually builds on about 15 years of work with veterans that we've been doing at the University of British Columbia that culminated about 2 years ago in the launch of a national veterans transition program. But the beginning of that work with veterans was informed by my colleague, Dr. David Kuhl, who was at the time running a palliative care ward at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver. And what he was discovering was that he had quite a number of Second World War and Korean War veterans who were coming into his care, and they had a kind of pain and suffering that he could not treat. And this led him to call for another colleague, Dr. Marv Westwood at the University of British Columbia, a psychologist. And the two of them started running life review groups with Second World War veterans. Life review, just talking about their experience, sharing it in a facilitated peer environment. And what those veterans said was that they had not spoken to anybody about their service, about these events, unless it was while they were drunk at the local Legion. They had not had a constructive conversation, and they didn't know that their own reactions were actually fairly common. And they said to my colleagues, the only problem with this program is that it's 60 years too late. And so we started working with a younger cohort. We started working with young veterans, 21, 22, 23. We started working with in Canada, our National Police Force are also veterans and are considered veterans. So we started bringing them into the program as well. We welcome people. We had service members from Australia. If you'd served in the military in one of our allied countries, we welcomed you into the program. And these young men and women started to say a similar thing. They said, your program is fantastic. There's only one problem. I needed this earlier in my career. And so when one of those veterans who had transitioned out of the military and become a firefighter welcomed me and said, we need this. And we'd had a number of high profile, and one of our Surrey firefighter, one of our cities in Greater Vancouver, we'd had 3 suicides in the space of about 8 months. And when you're looking at a very small organization of that kind, there's only 3,000 professional firefighters in all of British Columbia. That kind of loss just reverberates through the ranks. And so he'd said, come, we need to do something for our members. They are suffering and we don't have anything. And that's what led to about 30 qualitative interviews, sitting down with firefighters from all parts, from being recruits to 30 years of service, trying to get an understanding, because I'd never worked with firefighters except, on an individual basis, and I was astounded by what I found out, by what they told me about their daily service. As an example, one gentleman, 18 years of service, calculated his number of calls to be over 10,000, and he figured that about 10% of those were hard calls. Well, that's an extraordinary exposure. I also discovered that it very often wasn't the bloody, gory mess. It wasn't the really obvious trauma. It was a simple experience that collapsed the boundary between what was this kind of professional distance, and all of a sudden it became personal. That yes, it was a SIDS death, an infant mortality, but that little boy was wearing the same snuggly as your own son back home. And suddenly you carry that and you can't put it down. Things that can't be anticipated and can't be protected against. So what we did was we came through, we had the BC Professional Firefighters Association came on board. I wanted it to be a collaborative. I wanted it to be about firefighters helping firefighters. And we also wanted it to be owned by firefighters. It was their program, and it would be based on this idea, like the veterans program of veterans helping veterans, it would be firefighters helping firefighters. We received funding from Wounded Warriors Canada, and we started off a 3.5-day residential retreat The veterans program was 10 days over 3 phases. It was very intensive, and it was after the end of career. We wanted it to be upstream, 6 to 10 participants, and scalable, so 3.5 days. Upstream but screened, what does that mean? We didn't want people to have a formal diagnosis. We wanted to get in early, and we've heard that over and over again today, that getting the information to the people who need it on the ground early in their career is vital. But we wanted them to be screened because it was a peer-based program that we were creating. And so we wanted to know that they would be able to not use alcohol and drugs for the duration of a residential program. We wanted to know that they'd be able to tolerate being in a group setting, that they would be able, even if they didn't want to share their own story, that they'd be willing to tolerate hearing other people's stories. My colleague, Dr. David Kuhl, and myself facilitated. It's much, much easier. You're doing difficult work with a population in need. The more hands you got on deck, the easier the work is. But also 1 to 2 peer team leads. And this is an essential part because as a clinician, I really have no credibility. My credentials, my accomplishments don't mean anything to this population. But if I have, in this case it was a veteran and another firefighter who'd gone through similar programs, who can vouch for me, suddenly the other people in the room will give me a chance. It opens the door. The objectives: understanding operational stress, getting that information where it's needed early on. An opportunity to discuss experiences, to break the silence, to break that silence that holds the mythology of unaffected service, and to be able to create a space for facilitated sharing so that they could realize that people are having similar reactions. It's not abnormal. Tools to maintain or regain resilience, repair and improve relationships. Let's face it, if there is any kind of effect from traumatic exposure, the family is ground zero for all of those effects. And so if people are suffering, they're probably having some relationship damage. And so it's very easy to teach them active listening skills, to talk about curiosity, to have some conflict resolution and active listening that allows people to go back into their community, back into their family, and start to do the hard work of repairing those relationships. The other part of providing a good first mental health contact is to simply show up, break down the hierarchy, just be one of a human being in the room, to just meet at the same level, to shed tears with them over the difficult experiences, to be absolutely frank about what we know and also about what we don't know, to take challenges really well and show up. Because this initial contact, this is not a standalone program. It's not going to fix everything. But it allows a trusted relationship to start to emerge that allows us to start to move the people that need services into trusted services that are vetted, that are evidence-based, in order to pick up where we're going to leave off because we're not going to cover it all. We did pre and post testing. We've looked at some large data today. This is definitely the other end of the spectrum. This is small data. But this is really clinical data. And as a clinician, you're very often using these instruments not for a research purpose, but to look for an N of 1. You're looking to see, first of all, are you having any effect, but also are you having a negative effect, in which case you're going to change what you're doing. You have to be nimble and look for adverse outcomes. And so we did a pre and post testing, and we're doing 6 months testing. The first cohort's just coming in now. But looking at the PTSD checklist for the DSM-5, this is what we found. We found population, the average, the mean, above a clinical cut point. So we're working with people who are struggling. They're carrying some baggage from their work. But we're looking at a post-test 2 weeks later. And why 2 weeks? Well, there's always a honeymoon from group work. And so you're going to get an elevated score if you look at it right away. So giving a little bit of time allows people to go back into their world, come down a little bit, have the bubble burst. They're back in work, and they get to see, you get a little bit more of a sense of what's happening. What's really going to be the proof of the matter will be the 6 month and 1 year follow-up that we do. The first 6 people have come through out of this 20 that went through the first 3 cohorts, and those first 6 suggest that there's a slight uptick, but that the results are primarily holding. Again, this isn't a diagnosis of PTSD, this is a screening device for PTSD. Half met criteria before the program, a quarter met 2 weeks after. Looking at depression scores, moderate high, coming in, again, 20 people, and then coming into a minimal range 2 weeks after. You'll see that the N is 20, it's a small number, but the probability of, or the p-value of this is good for this. And the effect size, Cohen's d, which gives you a measure of the size of your effect, based as a standard deviation for depression, is just over 1 standard deviation of drop in depression scores. So these are very promising scores. This is not a randomized control. This is a very small pilot to try and prove a concept. And the outcome questionnaire 45.2, and again, looking at scores, mean scores above the clinical cut point, and you're looking at a drop below, again, for all 3 of these measures, clinically significant and statistically significant outcomes on a very small n. So this is promising. What I'm not going to do today, and we've talked a lot about what we can do, but what I'm going to go back to this question of culture. Because what we're actually doing in the program and getting this kind of outcome that seems to be durable at 6 months, jury's out, we're not doing something really new or innovative. It's really based, it's evidence-based. We're doing a lot of cognitive cognitive behavioral therapy. We're doing a written form of exposure therapy where you write out an event and you read it into the group, and then there's a very controlled kind of feedback session. All of this kind of thing, it's maybe a different deployment of the evidence, but it's all very much based on what we have learned. So what I want to talk about is how we deliver it, because it's not the what necessarily, it's the who needs it. And if we ask ourselves who needs it, then what can we say about how we deliver the information? So I want to touch on this, because a lot of thinkers who have thought about service communities have noted that there's a kind of traditional masculine gender role that's extended and emphasized in training into a cultural norm to prepare recruits for service and inculcate values of selfless sacrifice for the group. And so what do we mean by that? And we're not talking about biological sex. We're talking about a series of social roles, gender roles, that can be picked up by both men and women in service. And so the kind of attributes of this culture, we see toughness, intensity, strength, competition, discipline, courage, sacrifice, aggressiveness. These are actually really useful when you have hard work to do. And so what you hear is that when you're standing at the door and you're ready to go through with your troop, with your team, whether it's into a fire or a firefight, these are the kind of attributes that you want the men and women who are standing behind you to be displaying. And it's possible to do this. We can override a lot of our own stress response. I'm overriding a stress response already today, getting up on the stage. You know, my throat is dry. My hands were shaking when I got up. That's normal. We can override that. And we need the capacity to do that, and the capacity to do that in even high-threat situations. This works. And so culture, the military and first responder cultures, pick up these attributes and endorse them and extend them in training. And it sets a kind of stoic ideal. In service, what ends up happening is that you end up policing that in each other and regulating it in each other, but you also police it in yourself. You're always on the lookout for things in yourself that might not measure up. And so what we don't talk about as often, and this comes from really kind of gender research, Judith Butler, Christopher's work on abject, is it develops these kind of wariness, this threat, a specter of not measuring up, that somehow you could be found to be this kind of this abject identity or broken identity. And this is part of where this binary comes from, this problematic binary, that if you're not measuring up, then somehow, and if you experience any kind of impact from your service, that you may slip out, it's kind of fall from grace, and suddenly identify as being broken, that you're either strong or you're struggling. And so when you look at the experience of post-traumatic stress and impact, and You say, well, how does that fall? How would that be experienced within this cultural norm and with these cultural expectations? And what you find is that, well, a Stoic ideal asks you to display a kind of mastery of your environment. I know an operational stress injury such as PTSD would imbue you with a sense of helplessness. Similarly, mastery over thoughts on one side versus the intrusive thoughts of post-traumatic stress. Or mastery of the emotions versus the kind of emotional hijacking, the mood problems, the irritability that come with post-traumatic stress. Mastery over the body versus the hyperarousal, the hypervigilance, the exaggerated startle that might come with operational stress, even if that is just an acute reaction that you're going to recover from. And so on one side you have a Stoic ideal, and on the other this kind of abject or fallen identity. And so what happens is that within the cultural norm, we may change the language and talk about it as a disorder, as a health issue, but it's experienced as a basic fall from grace, as a sign, so diagnosis becomes evidence that you've failed. And we need to face the reality of that. It shows up in the stories of those who've served. There had always been a stigma around this throughout my life and career. It was hard for me to reconcile that who I thought was a strong man had these problems and needed the help of someone else. Can't reconcile that I'm strong and also struggle. At my work, psychologist is a dirty word. Nobody wants to see the psychologist. Like if you have to see the psychologist, then you're weak, broken. And so while our normal human response, and every species on the planet has some kind of stress response, usually we can stand up, respond to danger, and then stand down when there's safety. Respond, stand down, respond, stand down. And we do that multiple times on a deployment, in a day, on a shift. But there are situations where the brain has a fail-safe, and if there isn't safety to stand down in, your brain will switch over into a survival mode and adapt as if the world will always be chaotic and unsafe. Most individuals will end up experiencing a safe environment that will re-regulate, they'll adjust. But for some, especially if you numb out with drugs and alcohol, or if you go into avoidance of the triggers of this, then there will not be the spontaneous emergence of safety that will correct this. And so we know in therapy that we can create opportunities for countervailing experiences that undo the adaptation. We know that we can do that. But that's where we run into this problematic binary, because if we can't deliver that news in a way that's culturally relevant, then people won't show up for our evidence-based treatments. So I realize the timer has just started going and my time is up. But I want to just finish saying, letting the firefighters speak for themselves about some of their impacts. When you create a context where people can share in safety, in an environment of respect, what is their experience of that? When you mobilize respected peers within the community to talk about and to give permission to others to talk about their experience, to normalize the expectations of how we respond to stress, and to normalize the self-care required when your brain switches over into survival mode and you're robbed of the opportunity to just switch back spontaneously, and you actually have to do something about that in order to make that happen. And so we see these kind of responses, not to some kind of clinical miracle, but simply the very simple opportunity for peers to come together in a respectful environment and normalize what they're experiencing. Again, this kind of response to this kind of program, the program's too simple to get this kind of rave review. This shouldn't be happening. But I present it because it's their words, and these are their outcomes. This isn't my program, this belongs to firefighters. They did all of the heavy lifting and they got these outcomes. It belongs to them. But what we discovered was that resiliency emerges, and it emerges quite naturally in the context of relationship. Just as high performance does, we know every top athlete has a coach that brings out the best of them. Well, resiliency emerges in the context of relationship as well, and resources as well. One of the things Jacqueline Simmons Goldburn likened a transition from the military, but I think it's apt for this as well. to a kind of disaster preparedness, that when you have a known hazard, through the application of resources and skills, you can keep that hazard from becoming a disaster. I think that's a very apt metaphor for this. When we have cumulative trauma, we know that it's a known hazard. When we have a really big deployment with a lot of casualties, we know that's a known hazard. We can treat that, we can address that if we're prepared with the knowledge and resources. Because if we create the context where peers can come together, we can break that problematic binary and complicate their thinking so that they know that it's possible to be both strong and struggle, and that in times of struggle, actually the greatest determination, courage, fortitude comes out in order to address those times. And so that they can both struggle and be strong and stand tall. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.